Hello and welcome to the beginning of chapter 6 of the Gospel of Luke as we continue our reading through this fascinating gospel. Chapter 6 continues the same trend we saw through second half of chapter 4 and all of chapter 5, and that is this pattern of healing and teaching and calling disciples. And I may begin to sound like a broken record, but that's just because Luke is building this. And the question for us is, why does Luke keep this cycle going? And I think there's a couple of reasons for that, and we'll talk about that after I read this passage from the first part of Luke chapter 6, starting at verse 1, going through verse 16. Let us listen for the word of God. One Sabbath, while Jesus was going through some grain fields, his disciples plucked some heads of grain, rubbed them in their hands, and ate them. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.' On another Sabbath he entered the synagogue and taught, and there was a man whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees were watching to see whether he would cure on the Sabbath, so that they might find grounds to bring an accusation against him. But he knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man who had the withered hand, 'Come and stand in the middle.' He got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to them, 'I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it?' After looking around at all of them, he said to him, 'Stretch out your hand.' He did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and began discussing with one another what they might do to Jesus. Now during those days he went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, and his brother Andrew, and James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James, son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So both the teaching and the healing in this story center around the Sabbath. And let me just say a couple words about the Sabbath. The Sabbath in Judaism was and continues to be a day of primary importance. It's a day when there is to be no work. It is to mirror the Sabbath that God took after God made creation in 6 days. And in the seventh day, God rested. And it was in order not only to gain rest, because does God really need rest, but really to take it all in, to enjoy it. It's a day really of great, great joy. And I got a really wonderful view into the Sabbath when we lived in St. Louis. For 5 years, we lived in a neighborhood that was predominantly Orthodox Jewish. There were a couple of synagogues not far from our house, and because you can't work on the Sabbath, you can't drive a car on the Sabbath. However, you can walk. And so you can walk to the synagogue, because that's where the synagogues were. Many Orthodox Jews lived in that community, so they would be within walking distance of their synagogue. We got to know our neighbors across the street, the Steins, and got a wonderful window into what Sabbath meant. Ellen, who was the mom of the family, would spend all day Friday cooking because she had to make food not only for Friday night, but for Saturday breakfast and for Saturday lunch. And if you needed a snack on Saturday afternoon, because there's no work to be done from sundown on Saturday until sundown, or on Friday until sundown on Saturday. So it was a lot of work for her to get ready for the Sabbath. But once the Sabbath started, she could then relax because the food was ready, the family was gathered, and the meal was sort of this combination of family devotions and eating wonderful food. Many of the foods that they would eat had great spiritual and historical significance, but it was really a time for the family to be together. And one of the wonderful things for the Jewish community who observes the Sabbath is that you never ever have your kids saying, yeah, but can't I go out with my friends tonight? I'd rather do that. Or there's a new movie opening tonight. This was such sacred, not just religious time, but family time, that the kids didn't even ask because they knew that the answer would be, of course not. We're having Sabbath together. And it was funny, the two younger sons, Ari and David, they were in high school when we first moved there, and because turning on the radio was considered work, they couldn't hear the score of the ball game. And so I would be out in the yard raking leaves or playing with the kids, and they'd come over and say, do you know what the score of the Cardinals game is? And I often did, and it would be fun to share that with them. They could learn who was winning, they just couldn't listen to it for themselves. And so you spent your Sabbath eating with family, having wonderful just family time and fellowship. Friends could come over, enjoy the meal as well. You would go to synagogue both on Friday evening and on Saturday morning, and sometimes again at the end of the day on Saturday. You would rest, you would read. I remember every day Ellen would come out of her house after having her mid-afternoon nap on Saturday. And she was a very tall, elegant woman, and she would sort of just look so refreshed. And I would say, Ellen, how's your Sabbath? And more than a couple times she'd say to me, you know, Dan, I think this may be the best Sabbath I've ever had. And what a wonderful thing to look forward to, is to each week to have the best Sabbath you've ever had. Christians have a Sabbath, of course, it's Sunday, and we used to, by law, be able to really enjoy the Sabbath because we had blue laws, and it meant stores weren't open, there were no sports on Sunday, professional sports, yes, but not soccer games or Little League or any of that. The movies weren't open. You went to church, and then you would go home and have your Sunday dinner, and then just kind of hang out all day. My dad had a story when he was a little boy, and the neighbor boy came over on Sunday afternoon when his family was having their Sabbath time after church and after dinner. And they would listen to the radio. They would always listen to the Texaco Metropolitan Opera. They loved the opera at my dad's house. And the little neighbor boy came and asked for my dad's younger brother, and he had his baseball glove and bat, and said, hey, David, do you want to come out and play? And David, who had been well enculturated by his family, said, don't you know it's the Sabbath? And said, no, I can't go out. And then they would go on a family walk and then have their supper together. It was a lovely day. And we've lost that. And I think we've lost a lot with that because we miss that day that is built around joy. We lose that day where we just focus on God and on the relationships that God has provided for us. We're often running now on Sundays, and it just becomes another busy day. And I think that's unfortunate. I'm glad we gather on Sundays as a congregation. I love that we have lunch with our kids, and then they have an extended learning time after that. So we have actually built over the last couple of years, because of COVID and because our air conditioner's been out, we have more Sabbath, at least for our kids. For those who are making lunch, it can get pretty hectic sometimes. But how lovely that we can spend some hours together learning, having fellowship, and enjoying God's good creation. And that's what's happening in this first story. Jesus and his disciples are walking through the grain fields, and they're hungry. You know, it's the middle of the day, you need a snack, and the grain heads were fully ripe, and so that you can just, if you run your hand along them, the grains will break off into your hand, and you have a handful of instant snack. And they would eat it. And the Pharisees, who were a sect of Jews during Jesus' time who believed that the fortunes of the nation of Israel could only be restored through a very strict observance of the law. They were not bad people. They were not evil people. We sometimes use the word Pharisee to mean someone who's uptight. Their uptightness came not because they just loved rules so much, but they believed that God had turned his back on them because they had turned their back on God. And it was really a powerful renewal movement. And so they grew very concerned because Jesus' disciples are violating the Sabbath. They're working, they're picking, they're harvesting wheat, and that is to happen on the other 6 days and not on the Sabbath. But Jesus, in this moment, in this teaching moment, kind of reframes what Sabbath is. First, he says, don't you know that David, he was hungry. He ate like the holy bread. Think of this like, let's say the lawn mowing crew is outside working for an extra long time, and they come in and they're just starving, and the communion loaf is already on the table. And they think, well, there's a snack, and I just ate it. I think some people would be appalled, one, because it wasn't theirs to take, but two, that's holy bread, that's sacred bread, that's for communion. What are you doing? But Jesus says, the whole point of Sabbath is to be filled. And to get too particular about the rules and miss the beauty, the blessing of the day is to miss the whole point of Sabbath. It's not to deny ourselves. It's to enjoy God's good creation. And so he says, the Son of Man, meaning himself, is Lord of the Sabbath. I am here that the Sabbath might be a full experience. And so it's not wrong to enjoy that good creation. And so it's a beautiful reframing of Sabbath. And then Luke, almost with tongue-in-cheek, since we're talking about Sabbath, let me tell you a story of another Sabbath. And he says in verse 6, on another Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue and taught. So here we are back to this teaching ministry again. We know it's going to circle or center around the Sabbath because it's already been introduced in the previous chapter as an issue. And the very first healing of the man who had the unclean spirit also happened on a Sabbath when Jesus was teaching in the synagogue. And this time the scribes and Pharisees are there, and they're kind of watching and waiting to see if Jesus is going to violate the rules yet again. And Jesus knows what they're thinking. He knows what's at stake here. If Jesus is anything, he is always aware of the setting he's in. He understands the symbolic nature of his actions, that this is provocative. Sometimes we don't want the church to be provocative. We don't want to ruffle feathers. And there's lots of good reasons to keep the peace always. And yet, as followers of Jesus Christ, if we're not ruffling feathers, not just other people, but our own some of the time, I think we're not following Jesus very closely, because he was always pushing, always challenging, always helping us to look deeper, because it's hard to look deeper. It's hard to think differently, to see differently, to act differently if we're always in our comfort zone. And so this is this moment where Jesus kind of pokes at them. And he knows he's poking at them. And so he sees this man with a withered hand and says to come and stand in the middle of everyone. And then he doesn't ask the man, but he asks those who are around, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it? And there are lots of exceptions, of course, to the rules of Sabbath. To save life, we are called to act. To save an animal that's fallen into the ditch. You don't wait until the next day. You get your group together and you work to get it out, because God is the Lord of life, and the Sabbath is given to us not only to preserve life, but to enhance life. And so there's this beautiful moment where Jesus, again, wants Sabbath to have its full meaning. And for this man with a withered hand on that day, how much richer, how much fuller can his life be if he can use both of his hands to work? And so he says, stretch out your hand. And the man does, and the hand is restored. And of course, the crowd of his opponents are filled with fury, and they began to discuss what they might do about him. And this is now going to be another theme that Luke has introduced. It's happened a couple times now where the authorities are beginning to take notice and they don't like what they see. And so we'll watch for that as we read through Luke as well, because ultimately the culmination of the gospel occurs because of this collision between God, the authority of God that is revealed in Jesus Christ, and the authority of humans, both religious authorities and political authorities. And just so we don't forget that Jesus is always building his team, this part of the chapter 6 closes with Jesus fully building out his team. And we get the 12 disciples, whom he names apostles. And already there's more than 12 of them. It says he called his disciples and chose 12 of them. And why 12? Because Jacob had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. And so the church becomes the new Israel. And for Luke, especially, this new Israel is not just a Jewish entity, it is a universal one. His audience goes well beyond the boundaries of Palestine, and it goes well beyond Judaism, and it extends to Greeks and pagans and whoever is open to the word of God. And so this becomes the symbolic moment when the 12 disciples, and disciple is just the word that means those who learn, are also named apostles. And apostle means those who are sent. And that is the vision of our faith. We are called to Jesus to learn from him so he can send us out into the world. We're always being sent out. And then because we need to be revitalized, recharged, we need to be taught again, we need to be equipped again, we need to be comforted. Sometimes we need to be bound up, we need to be forgiven. All of those things that happen when we come together. And then Jesus attends to us that we might go out and be ministers to the world. And so this pattern continues, and there are the 12 disciples. We've already met Simon, and again, here's the next time we hear his name will be Peter. So Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James and John, who we also met. Those were the other two who were fixing their nets when that miraculous catch of fish happened. And then there's Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus. So there's two James. Simon, who is called the Zealot. The Zealots were a group of patriots, really, who believed that Rome would be expelled from the Holy Land through a violent uprising. So he has fishermen, he has a tax collector, at least we think Matthew, who went with Thomas in the previous verse, sometimes is associated with Levi, who was the tax collector. A couple of James, a religious hothead, Simon. There's Judas, the son of James. And then we're finally told Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. How interesting that we're only halfway through chapter 6 of a 24-chapter gospel, and already the plot is put in motion that Jesus will be betrayed. There's the old line that in a play, if you show a revolver or a pistol in Act 1, it will be used in Act 3. And we're still in Act 1 of Luke's Gospel, and early in the 6th chapter, and already Judas Iscariot, the pistol, has been shown, and we will anticipate and expect him to figure largely in the plot to come. There's a whole lot of gospel yet to come. Lots of teaching. The miracles will start to expand from just healing to feeding and other things as well. And we'll take note of that as we go. But already Luke, not only do we have opponents outside, the scribes, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, but now there is someone on the inside who will betray him as well. And so a powerful reminder that to follow Jesus is not an easy calling. It is not a light calling. It is not a soft calling. It is one that will require everything that we've got. And this story reminds us that because we have been called by the Lord of the Sabbath, we will have everything that we need. May God bless us all in this reading of God's holy word. Amen.